Hey there, everybody. I'm absolutely crazy about video games, and I had been getting a little tired of endlessly playing Minecraft parkour sessions. It was starting to feel too repetitive, so I figured I might as well try something fresh and see where it goes. If you all have any suggestions, or if you want to see me experiment with other similar games, drop me a line in the comments. By the way, my sister has tormented me for ages, yet she recently invited me to a dinner gathering. The moment I arrived, I realized everyone else had already finished eating, and to make matters worse, she practically ordered me to clear away all the plates and do the dishes, labeling me a pathetic server who was only good for wiping up spills. My sister Helen has consistently been the prized child of our family, and my parents have never been shy about emphasizing that fact in front of everyone. Being the youngest child, she was always lauded as my parents' miraculous gift. It had taken them numerous attempts to conceive her after having me, especially since my mother encountered serious health issues when I was born. Doctors actually advised my folks not to have more children, urging them to abandon the idea of a larger family. But then, unexpectedly, about 5 years later, my mother defied medical predictions and became pregnant again. My father was beyond thrilled, viewing Helen as some incredible blessing that made him feel like the luckiest man alive. Because of this miracle status, my sister's upbringing became an ongoing extravaganza of pampering. My parents spared no expense or effort in making her feel extraordinarily special, celebrating every accomplishment of hers with massive excitement. This partial treatment was never subtle. It shone through in countless, unmistakable ways that made me feel like a distant second place in their hearts. That's not to say I was completely ignored or neglected. My parents did make sure I had the basic things I needed, such as clothes, school supplies, and the occasional birthday present, but it always felt secondary to whatever they were doing for Helen. For example, if the two of us had school events scheduled on the same day, they would almost unfailingly choose to be present for hers. Their rationale was that, as the youngest, she required more parental support, as if what I was doing somehow didn't need as much encouragement. Another reminder of the imbalance was the family photo situation. My sister's baby pictures were carefully put together in multiple albums that my parents still keep proudly displayed. In comparison, they couldn't even manage to hold on to one complete album of me, claiming some storm had obliterated my pictures. It was incredibly disheartening, because I would have liked even a few images to remind me of how I looked as a baby. That difference drove the point home. My existence during childhood was never chronicled with the same level of care, leaving me with a persistent feeling of being unimportant. Living with Helen was also a trial in itself, because any issue she ran into was instantly resolved by my parents, no matter how small. But if I ever brought up my own troubles or voiced my own anxieties, I was labeled spoiled by my father, who dismissed my concerns outright. My mother, in turn, would call me dramatic or over-emotional whenever I felt anxious about trying something new or speaking to new people. She insisted I should be bold and outgoing just like Helen. This dismissive behavior from them made me feel like a supporting character in my own home. My sister's needs were always front and center, while my own were trivialized and brushed aside as if they didn't matter at all. It only got worse with the blame game my parents would play. If Helen ever messed up or did something wrong, I, being the older sibling, would bear the brunt of the responsibility. Apparently, I was supposed to have shown her how to behave and prevented her mistakes before they happened. It didn't matter if I was nowhere near the situation, or entirely unaware of what had taken place. My parents pinned it on me every time. Their logic was rooted in me being older, so I ought to look out for her and guide her morally. This constant undeserved blame only deepened the unmistakable fact that I was nothing more than the scapegoat in my own family, overshadowed by the pedestal they placed beneath my sister's feet. Helen, fully aware of her special status, expertly took advantage of it. She wielded her favored child position to get away with all sorts of things, no matter how minor or major. She would demand my possessions, insisting on wearing my clothes or borrowing my personal items, and if I refused, she'd whine to our parents. Their immediate response was that I was the bad person for not sharing with my dear, sweet sister. Curiously, she never allowed me the same courtesy. Her clothes and her belongings were strictly off limits. This inequity spilled into other areas as well, like our shared bedroom. She was fiercely territorial about her half, almost as if I didn't exist, and this attitude persisted even after we each had our own rooms. It was exhausting to navigate her demands, as she consistently demanded total access to my things while she guarded her own possessions like precious treasures. With the constant favoritism, accusations, and outright emotional mistreatment, I drifted into a severe state of depression. My self-esteem sank to its lowest depths, and I developed crippling worries about my appearance and identity. As a teenager, I was on edge all the time, especially when Helen picked fights or openly mocked me for my insecurities. The atmosphere at home felt intensely stifling, and my parents would occasionally raise their voices so aggressively that I would nearly have panic attacks on the spot. I vividly recall times when their yelling got so close and so loud that I'd experience choking sensations, as though their disapproval was physically suffocating me. In spite of all this, neither my sister nor my parents acknowledged or cared that I was struggling day in and day out. I felt like a prisoner in my own home, desperate for a measure of relief from all the chaos. My sole source of comfort became the journal I wrote in every single night. Pouring my feelings onto those pages was the only way I could capture and manage the fear and heartbreak I felt so constantly. It became my safe space, my one sanctuary where I could be open and honest, away from the judging stares of my family. I hid it under my bed each evening, fearing that Helen might discover it and scorn me even further for expressing my true emotions. That journal served as a fragile lifeline, a testament to my silent cries for help that existed purely in those pages. But one day, the worst possibility came true. While I was out, Helen, who never stopped snooping despite my repeated pleas for privacy, discovered my hidden journal. She must have read every raw confession and personal thought that I'd poured into it over the years. When I returned home that night, I found Helen together with my parents, all seated in a tense hush, as if something catastrophic had happened. My initial instinct was that maybe someone in our extended family had passed away, judging by the sorrowful looks on their faces. My father's tone was solemn when he asked me to sit down. As my heart pounded in my chest, I had no idea that the next moments would strip me of the only secrecy I had managed to maintain. I was floored when my mother revealed my journal. The immediate shock made me demand an explanation. How on earth had they gotten their hands on my most private writings? Helen watched me with a hint of triumph in her eyes, clearly relishing my panic. My mother, on the other hand, asked me in a strangely measured voice if the things I had written truly echoed my inner emotions. I felt so betrayed it was almost impossible to speak. I admitted that, yes, the writings were accurate reflections of how I felt, but I also argued that it was not fair for them to invade my privacy. I had written those words in confidence, never anticipating my family would read them. My father, however, shook his head, his expression filled with a grave kind of disappointment. He insisted that the thoughts in my journal showed I might be some sort of dangerous person who needed psychological help. He was convinced I harbored hateful feelings toward them, which was completely untrue. I had never, in any entry, described any desire to harm them. I had simply recorded the pain I felt over their favoritism and the unequal treatment I had endured. It was appalling to see how they twisted my narrative, turning my cry for understanding into an ominous sign that I was mentally unstable. My parents then erupted in condemnation, telling me it was abnormal and dark to maintain a journal filled with such serious subject matter. They labeled me a deeply troubled person, accusing me of fabricating the entire story of their mistreatment. My mother went as far as declaring that I needed urgent care before I did something terrible, insisting that my perspective was delusional. Helen chimed in too, saying it was humiliating to admit I was her sister, because normal people just didn't write down all these negative emotions. My attempt to reason with them fell on deaf ears. I tried explaining that I wrote only about my feelings and experiences, never expressing any violence or extreme hatred. Yet it was pointless. They had already decided I was the menace. From that moment on, my parents insisted I see a psychiatrist immediately, claiming they were scared I would do something unthinkable if left untreated. That declaration left me feeling hollow. I stood there drowning in betrayal, astounded that instead of grasping how hurt I was by the events described in my journal, they were more concerned with pinning me as the villain. All my hopes for them to finally validate my emotions vanished into thin air as I realized they had no intention of understanding me, or their own role in the pain I was suffering. When the psychiatric sessions began, I was filled with an overwhelming sense of shame, as though I had indeed done something undeniably wrong. My parents' accusations reverberated in my head, making me believe I was the central problem in our household. Because I was so closed off, my psychiatrist took a gentle approach, using my journal excerpts as discussion starters to get me to open up. It was an odd relief to have someone actually read my words and treat them seriously rather than condemning me. Gradually, I found comfort in speaking with my psychiatrist, and it became easier to share the humiliating details of my everyday life. As the weeks went by, I developed a level of trust in my psychiatrist that allowed me to talk more freely about the favoritism, the constant belittling, and the inescapable sense of insignificance that had shaped my childhood and adolescence. For once, I felt heard by someone who validated the reality of what I had been through. Slowly, I grasped that I was not the wicked figure my family had made me out to be. Instead, I was a wounded person, an individual weighed down by years of disregard, forced to believe that my worth was minimal compared to my sister's. Eventually, my psychiatrist invited my parents in for a joint session to bring these issues to light. During that session, she made it very clear how inappropriate and destructive it was for them to treat me like a second-class daughter. My parents were visibly shocked, neither expecting nor prepared for the psychologist to confront them directly. At first, they tried to defend themselves, pointing out that they had always provided a decent life for me and that I should be appreciative. But my psychiatrist refused to back down. She reminded them that having children is a choice, and their responsibility goes far beyond offering a roof and financial support. Emotional well-being is crucial, and they had blatantly fallen short by consistently favoring Helen. My psychiatrist laid out instance after instance where my parents had let me down. She described their partiality, the blame they piled onto me, and the emotional distance they always displayed. She revealed how this dynamic had contributed to my severe anxiety and depression. By the end, my parents looked humiliated, as though they were forced to finally see the facts. And in that fleeting moment, I held a slender hope that maybe they would change. Yet, in the car on the way home, all my optimism was crushed. My father declared that I would no longer be allowed to see the psychiatrist, implying she was prejudiced in my favor. My mother chimed in, stating it was a waste of money to invest in therapy if I was just going to fault them for everything. Their reaction demonstrated they had no real interest in admitting the damage they had caused. I felt defeated, but not entirely broken. At the very least, those therapy sessions had given me new emotional tools and a better understanding of my situation. Since I was still underage, I had no choice but to obey their demand to quit therapy. Nonetheless, the sessions I did have equipped me with coping strategies and a renewed conviction that I wasn't inherently at fault for my family's problems. I resolved to secure my own future, focusing intently on my academic performance as a pathway to independence. I doubled down on studying, putting all my energy into achieving stellar grades, so I could earn scholarships and escape that suffocating household once I turned 18. I also made it a point to detach emotionally from my parents and sister. During family interactions, I would shut myself off mentally just to survive. I realized journaling at home was risky since any future discovery of my notebooks might escalate the tension again. Hence, I stopped writing in a physical diary, opting for more private ways of processing my emotions. Each passing day, my determination to get out grew stronger. Eventually, my dedication paid off, and I was accepted into an excellent university with a full scholarship. Of course, my parents disapproved because the school was located far away, but I refused to let their opinion deter me. Before I left, I gathered all my critical documents, birth certificate, social security, and anything else necessary for an adult life, ensuring they couldn't hold me back. Unbeknownst to them, I was giving them my final wave goodbye for a long time. Once I stepped onto campus, I effectively vanished from their daily reach. In the years that followed, I kept them at arm's length. I did not come home for holidays or breaks, and I seldom answered their phone calls. Whenever they tried guilt-tripping me or blaming me for distancing myself, I refused to engage, cutting off conversations before they could start manipulating me again. I was also careful to stay out of my sister's life. I wanted no part of her negativity. For the first time, my life was firmly in my own hands, and I vowed not to return to the toxic environment that had caused me such pain. Even after I finished my degree and secured a wonderful job, I maintained a distant yet polite stance with my parents. They got the same emotional coldness that they had shown me all my life. Time flew, and at some point, the day arrived when I got engaged to the love of my life. News of my upcoming wedding spread through the grapevine, until it eventually reached my parents. Realizing that they had been excluded from my wedding arrangements, they reached out in a clearly shocked and agitated state. Their phone call carried a sincerity I had rarely heard before. They offered me a remorseful apology, acknowledging that they had made countless mistakes in raising us, and that they regretted singling me out with such unfair treatment. They pleaded with me for a second chance, explaining that they wanted to build new memories together, especially now that I was about to start my own family. Their apology was genuinely startling, and it stirred up a swirl of complicated emotions. Nonetheless, I concluded that I was embarking on a new chapter in life, and clinging to anger would not help me grow. So, I chose to forgive them and invited them to the wedding. They asked that I extend the same invitation to Helen, but I firmly declined and, to my surprise, they respected that decision without further argument. During the wedding, my parents appeared truly overjoyed for both me and my spouse. I have no regret about letting them attend. Seeing their honest happiness warmed my heart and felt like a step toward healing. Following the ceremony, I occasionally dropped by their home for dinner, sharing small updates about my new life. During some of these visits, I inevitably encountered Helen. Her mean streak never faded. She would hurl subtle jabs at my marriage and loved ones, hoping to spark conflict or provoke me into some show of distress. I quickly stood my ground, responding calmly yet firmly, making sure she knew I wouldn't accept her snide remarks anymore. Over time, I discovered Helen felt resentful that I had a fantastic rapport with my in-laws, whereas her husband's family didn't think much of her. Her frustration grew even thicker once she learned about my stable and loving relationships, and so she remained just as hostile and bitter as before. Then, 4 months ago, I got the thrilling news that I was pregnant. Both my husband and I were ecstatic, and because he earns twice my salary, we decided I would temporarily leave my job to focus on the pregnancy. My mother and father-in-law were also fully behind this plan, offering me unending support and reassurance. When Helen learned of this choice, she flew into a rage. She was never permitted to become a stay-at-home mom, as she and her husband needed 2 incomes. She never got a real break during her pregnancy, and it seemed, she couldn't handle seeing me enjoy something she didn't have. Every time we interacted, she lashed out, labeling me foolish for stepping away from my career, and calling it degrading to be a stay-at-home parent. I typically answered calmly, pointing out that with my background and expertise, I could easily go back to work once I was ready. She tried spinning my narrative to paint my husband as domineering, but ironically, it was completely my own decision to focus on my pregnancy at this point. Recognizing that her remarks had everything to do with her personal bitterness, I resolved to steer clear of her drama and keep my serenity during this joyous phase. About a week ago, Helen phoned me with an invitation to a dinner gathering she was organizing, a grand affair that included not only our own relatives, but also her in-laws. Although I hadn't gone out much since confirming the pregnancy, I figured it might do me some good to socialize. Being in a larger group might also reduce the chances of her targeting me. I accepted and planned to attend with my husband, but circumstances took an unexpected turn. My spouse was saddled with some urgent work obligations that kept him tied up late into the night. Feeling guilty, he kept texting me about the delay, but I reassured him that these things just happen sometimes, and we'd still try to make an appearance. By the time he finally swung by to pick me up, the dinner was well underway, and we were indeed very late. Still, I believed attending late was better than not attending at all, so we set off. Upon our arrival, it became immediately obvious that most guests had finished eating, and a lot of them were just lingering around, chatting. Even my parents had left earlier, because my dad hated driving after dark. Helen hurried over, quite annoyed that we hadn't come sooner. Naturally, I offered an apology on my husband's behalf, feeling somewhat embarrassed too. Helen guided him to a chair and handed him some leftovers, which was a relief, but then she whisked me aside into the kitchen for a private chat. She informed me that, since everyone had gone for second or third helpings, there was no food remaining for me. My disappointment was intense, considering I was both hungry and pregnant. I suggested maybe ordering some takeaway to keep things simple, and she agreed, saying she could order some food for me. However, at that exact moment, She also dropped the bombshell that because I was so late and hadn't assisted with dinner preparation, I should at least clean up the dishes. I felt a flash of anger and disbelief. I told her that expecting me to do the cleanup for her dinner guests merely because I arrived late was uncalled for. She, of course, responded with exasperation, citing how our mother had pitched in to serve dinner. She grumbled that her own husband never did kitchen chores, so she required another pair of hands. I snapped back that if she was this overwhelmed, maybe she shouldn't have hosted such a large gathering to begin with. Helen's eyes blazed, and she hissed that I couldn't possibly comprehend her problems. She demanded I keep my mouth shut and just do as she asked. Then she delivered a vicious line, implying that now that I was pregnant, I was nothing more than a pitiful server for my own spouse, so why not act like one here as well? Her words stung me to the core, and combined with my exhaustion and hunger, tears threatened to roll down my cheeks. Striving not to break down in front of her, I dashed to one of the bedrooms and locked myself in, needing a moment to breathe and prevent a complete meltdown. Inside that room, the old anxiety I'd experienced growing up began welling up. I could sense a panic attack creeping closer, recalling those moments of suffocation under my parents yelling. My chest felt tight, and I desperately hoped no one would notice or come searching for me. I wanted a few minutes alone to collect myself, to push the stress back down. When I finally calmed down, I realized I had reached a point of no return with Helen. She had crossed my boundaries far too many times, and I was determined to teach her once and for all that she couldn't keep trampling on me. I made up my mind to retaliate. Over the years, I had taken photos of my journal pages and stored them in my email to ensure they'd never be lost. These entries contained all the humiliations I had suffered at her hands. I decided I would send these files to the one person Helen dreaded confronting more than anyone else, her own husband. That night, before my husband and I took off, I emailed the scanned pages of my journals directly to my brother-in-law. I composed a thorough message detailing the history of bullying I had endured, along with the events of this dinner party. I explained that Helen seemed to harbor a lot of jealousy about my relationship, and that her bitterness had come to a head. I wanted him to understand exactly who Helen was when no one else was looking and how her insufferable behavior had scarred me for years. Unsurprisingly, this sparked a ferocious argument between Bill and Helen. He was in disbelief at the extent of her bullying, and he confronted her immediately. My parents soon got wind of this conflict, and my mother quickly blamed me. She accused me of crossing a line by dragging my sister's personal dynamics into her marriage. My dad attempted to take a neutral stance, though it was obvious he was upset that I had exposed Helen in such a blatant way. Yet, in all honesty, I felt my sister had it coming after so many years of her belittling words and malicious pranks. Update 1. Many of you have asked about my husband's reaction. He became absolutely infuriated upon learning what Helen had said during the dinner. He had been oblivious to her vile comments in the moment. When I told him, he immediately called my sister, and sternly informed her that he would not tolerate such attacks against me. I had never seen him so agitated, and I imagine Helen was startled by his forcefulness. He instructed her not to speak about our household, or our marriage in any belittling manner, particularly since she lacked the full context of our life together. Update 2. As for my brother-in-law, the reason he was so enraged with Helen was that his relatives have always seen her as self-centered and rude. Over the years, whenever trouble arose in their home, Helen would blame everyone else, refusing to accept any accountability. Bill overlooked these warning signs, because he genuinely loved her. But when I sent him those journal entries, it was like a veil had lifted from his eyes. He realized that Helen had been mistreating me for a very long time, and she had never told him the real story behind our family dynamics. While Bill had always recognized a certain frostiness between Helen and me, he believed it was nothing out of the ordinary between siblings. Now he fully grasped how deep the resentment went, and it echoed what his own parents had told him about Helen, that she was rarely as innocent as she claimed. Bill reached out to me recently and asked me to recount everything step by step, which I did, describing the years of emotional torment and how our parents had set the stage for Helen's inflated ego and my sense of worthlessness. I even explained how a psychiatrist had once attempted to mediate with my parents, but they'd refused to continue the treatment when confronted with the ugly truth of their favoritism. Bill admitted he had faced similar manipulation from Helen on smaller issues, and was suddenly seeing their marriage in a new light. He was genuinely concerned about whether she might treat their child with the same cruelty she had used against me, especially in moments he wouldn't witness. Update 3. Let me clarify a few lingering questions. My sister blames me 100% for the fallout. She's bombarded my phone with nasty text messages, which caused my husband to step in and warn her she'd face serious consequences if she kept it up. She's since gone silent, not reaching out even once. My mother is pressuring me to apologize, and claims I exaggerated what happened in my childhood. She insists I tell Bill I embellished everything, but I stood firm and reminded her that, if she insisted on supporting Helen's version of events, I'd cut her off again. My father acknowledges he understands the reasons behind my actions, but it's a tense situation. Finally, I'm unsure what Bill might decide regarding his future with Helen. I only know that my goal was to show her that she couldn't continue to degrade me without consequences. I stand by my decision, believing it was necessary to defend my own dignity, and remind her that there are limits to what I will tolerate. Whether Bill chooses to stay with her or separate is in his hands, and I have no regrets about exposing my sister's genuine nature to him.